from the Swedish experience. And I started my presentation by providing a little bit of background and going especially to the Paris Agreement, which relates to how we can achieve significant reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent global warming. And so this Paris Agreement has also been related to stipulating, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals. And within this package of policy instruments, we see a lot of focus around water and around energy. When we're thinking about energy, it's usually in relation to greenhouse gas emissions and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And when we're talking about water, it's usually about addressing vulnerabilities and risks, such as, for instance, related to flooding, quality of water, and other aspects. What's most important with respect to these types of discussions happening globally is that we see increasing interlinkage between discussions around water and discussions around energy. And this has been otherwise referred to as a nexus, as indeed we see similar kinds of intersectoral kind of nexus challenges with respect to food and water and energy and food. Today I will focus primarily on the water and energy nexus. I want to try and demonstrate ways in which we need to think about the transition of water and energy as sort of happening together at this point. And if we look at some other interesting developments that are happening, again, at the global context, I wanted to refer you also to this article that was published not so long ago in The Economist, where they are particularly discussing the role of renewable energy in this changing context, and they are referring to a world turned upside down. And so what this article in particular is touching upon is a kind of a disruptive innovation that is taking place in energy markets, instigated particularly by the rise of, for instance, wind technology, but also solar technology. And this has been pushed or been propagated by a number of different interacting processes. One of which being, of course, the rapid reduction of costs for wind and solar energy, for instance. But there have also been other kinds of processes related to that, such as, for instance, specific policies and subsidies by governments, specifically, for instance, in the European Union, to expand wind and solar energy. But if we look a little bit more carefully at that, it's interesting to see how this kind of development, this kind of disruptiveness is also in a way challenging dominant values and structures with respect to how energy should be produced. But then on the other hand, and I'm referring here particularly to sort of dominant models about fossil-based energy production and dominant models around centralized distribution of energy, for instance. And so we are now in a situation where there is a kind of an absence of a new agreed equilibrium. And that's why I'm interested and inspired by this idea of the winners and losers in energy and water transitions, because we have different players actually that are interacting with each other, and as of now there is no new consensus. There's no consensus about where these transitions should be heading. It's a kind of a fluid moment in time that we are in. So I wanted to turn and trying to make this kind of a bit more concrete, and that's where the Swedish experience is useful for the purposes of this discussion. And I wanted to show, for instance, some very general patterns that if we look at the energy usage of the country, we see that a big chunk of that energy is actually dedicated to the residential and service sector, essentially that comprises of buildings for housing and other types of other type of purposes. So that chunk of energy use takes up more than 40% of the actual usage of the country, and that means also that a significant part of greenhouse gas emissions and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions have to occur within this sector. And yet, this is also a sector which is not discussed as such very frequently in terms of what kind of possibilities there are to address that. And another interesting thing that I wanted to flag to you, linking again to the sector, is and how this nexus problem comes into place, is that there is energy not only that is being lost from properties, for instance, through the sewers, and that has been recently covered actually in a BBC article about energy from our buildings essentially circulating beneath the streets and being effectively lost when that energy could be recovered. And so that creates a number of interesting questions, not only about energy efficiency, but also energy recovery. And actually, some of that energy that is to be recovered can be found in the wastewater, in the water essentially. So this is a kind of a nexus issue that is interesting, because it means that if we want to recover that energy, we need to essentially find interconnections between institutions and governance mechanisms that are to deal with water, and equally institutions and governance mechanisms that are there to deal with energy decisions and questions. And I want to bring you then now to some interesting developments in Sweden. This is a picture that has been taken from actually my campus, KTH campus, and it has been taken by, this is situated in one of the buildings at KTH, which at the basement of one of the buildings of KTH, which is a building which is for students to live in. But this is not an ordinary building, in a sense that this is a building where the students are essentially agreed upon, have consented to participate in a number of interesting and radical experiments to improve efficiency of this particular building. And so in a way we can see this is a kind of a niche of different types of innovations for water and energy. And a lot of this activity, a lot of these technical installations are actually begin from the basement. And this is one of the main, the person there is one of the main directors of this facility, discussing and having open days for discussions about different types of innovations. And here also they have, for instance, installed systems for heat recovery from wastewater, amongst other things. But what I want to particularly illustrate here is this new types of actors entering this discussion about water and energy that are not the traditional actors. They are somehow coming from a different point of view. They are seeing a challenge that they want to address. They have some kind of environmental concern that they're interested in, but also a business opportunity. So they're not the conventional actors that tend to drive decisions around energy and water. And so this creates a kind of a heterogeneity in the space for transitions. And we see other similar examples actually in Sweden with actors that are not the traditional actors, that have something to say, something new to say about how to achieve some of these broader targets that have been stipulated in the Paris Agreement and elsewhere in Sweden. And I want to tell you a little bit about how we are trying to look at this more concretely through a research project that we have. conceived here, which is called Ensuring Sustainability and Equality of Water and Energy Systems During Actor-Driven Disruptive Innovation, which in short means, can be remembered as the acronym SEQUENCE. And in this particular project, which is funded by FORMAS, which is essentially the funding body which funds a lot of research that's linked to sustainable development, for instance, and is particularly connected to research initiatives that take an interdisciplinary approach. And for that reason, actually, we are a very interdisciplinary team, which includes, amongst other things, historians, social scientists, such as myself, but also energy modelers and people that are much more versed in these particular innovations and how well they perform and so on. So this is actually quite fitting, given that also KTH is a technological university as such. And so we're trying here to draw on a number of different perspectives that we have developed in other work, such as, for instance, of course, around energy and water engineering, socio-ecological systems, so which relates a lot to developing a kind of a systems approach where we try to think about social processes in relation to ecological processes, for instance. But also the field of transition studies, which allows us to look at technology and innovation as an evolving process. History and industrial management, which allows us to look a little bit at the history of how these things, what caused these things to develop in the way that they have, and what could that mean for transitions. And I will talk a little bit more about that in the next slides. And also the field of urban political ecology, which is a field that is of interest to us because it talks a lot about, since a lot of this research is based in cities or around cities, we are interested also in how all of these things are shaped by changing processes at the city, of the city at large. How urban development might change these types of processes in different directions. So we have essentially three components that are kind of running in parallel. One is to develop case studies of on-property water and heat recovery. So we're looking at some of these innovations that are related particularly to the residential sector and try to understand from a performance point of view how this nexus is actually operated, how well does it actually work, how appealing it is. So a lot of these studies are actually quite technical. But then we also have another component which is related to understanding the actors around which certain niches of innovation develop. And finally, we have a case or a work package component, which is about developing future scenarios. So once we have developed evidence around these case studies, and once we've understood about the actors and the systems, we try to look a little bit about what the future might look like. And I will tell you a little bit more also about that in following slides. And in parallel, actually, we have another component which is noted here as work package 4. But this is actually quite a crucial component of the research, which is about actually trying to develop a dialogue with these actors and actually to bring the traditional and non-traditional actors together in a discussion. So that's actually, as we get information, as we get new results from the project, we try to essentially use that information as a basis for bringing different actors together to discuss some of these innovations. And we are particularly inspired by one actually highly influential approach, especially in the transition discussion, which is called the multi-level perspective, firstly initiated by Frank Hills and presented as a framework in research policy in 2002. And I just briefly want to touch on this schematic. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it or not, but it's basically a a way in which to think about the evolution of innovation in different phases, in different historical phases, but also across different system levels. And importantly for us, we are drawing on some concepts from the MLP. And so the concepts that are particularly of interest to our research is first of all the landscape level, and that is essentially a very broad level of organization which might relate to, for instance, legislative frameworks, and but also policy and economic processes. It's also related to values and norms in society about, for instance, about ways in which to organize water or ways in which to organize energy distribution. We do not engage very explicitly with the landscape level in our research, but we do regard this as being an important aspect of how these changes are actually instigated. More importantly for us is the regime level. So for us, the regime level is especially when one looks at water and energy system, it sort of takes place at a much more meso level. And this is where you have really the organizations and technology systems that tend to make important decisions, that tend to drive these kinds of systems forward. So that's kind of an important system level for us and how we look at energy and transitions, particularly in cities. And finally, we have a different type of terminology, which is talking about local level or niche level innovation. And that is the level at which we see these types of small-scale experimentation, where we see experimentation with not only technical instruments like technical, but also practices, new ways of doing things, new types of business models. And sometimes one would coin the niche level is where this is more radical groups, essentially radical in the sense that they have a very different type of innovation in which that they're operating with. And that could be NGOs, communities, private entrepreneurs, but it also could be like pilot projects, like by larger organizations. And I think a lot of the work that we are doing here is linked more to these types of pilot projects that are driven by larger organizations, as for example, large property companies that have essentially driven these pilot projects in parts of their building stock. And I want to focus a little bit now on why regimes matter, socio-technical regimes, why they matter for us, and why we think that they are particularly important when we're thinking about water and energy transitions. So in a way, a regime creates a very concrete boundary around the kind of operating space in which an innovation can take place. And in a way, if we look at water, this could be like the physical infrastructure. So for instance, the water grid, a centralized water grid that is comprised of pipes and networks of pipes combined with wastewater and water treatment plants. That is a very concrete physical infrastructure that is tied to a particular regime. And that is also typically tied to a specific organizational design. So for instance, a water company that essentially is distributing water to a city. That is a type of organizational design. And so these kinds of regimes have developed over many, many years. And I just want to show you here a small illustration. This is in the early 20th century, where the beginning of this physical infrastructure was installed in Stockholm. So that infrastructure was developed more than 100 years ago, but it's still the predominant infrastructure through which water is distributed in the city. So there is a very strong historical path dependency around regimes. And there's a particular system logic which doesn't actually always allow a lot of space for change. because it is difficult to actually change an established architecture of standardized components, stable hierarchies, and specific business models that have been developed and serve a particular function. So in some senses, we could say that in energy and water, the regimes tend to be quite conservative, quite conservative in terms of the systems that they have developed. And this conservatism is linked to the expertise which is used to develop regimes for water and energy, but is also linked to the type of infrastructures that are actually very hard to change or adapt. and so these types of regimes have an important role, particularly in the context of cities, and here referring particularly to Stockholm. We also, to understand how these regimes functions, then we also look conceptually, we feel like we need to look a little bit further than the MLP model, the HEALS MLP model. We feel like there is a need that it only partially addresses our interests with how innovation evolves. And for that, to really understand the kinds of things that we're seeing today, we really need to look further than Sweden. And some of my colleagues that are also involved in this project, they have done quite interesting work, for instance, in Nairobi, looking at the role of the water company of Nairobi City and the types of approaches they are using there to develop essentially an effective water service. But given this background of the SDGs, they also need to develop a business model that is equitable in a sense that it's reachable to all parts of the population. So that is a difficult bargain for a company like the Nairobi City and Water Sewage Company. And something that they have done is to essentially maintain a kind of a business as usual by ensuring that part of the system operates as it is, but at the same time, in order to cover those areas that are not served by the regime, they have developed these prepaid water dispensers in low-income settlements of Nairobi. And so what we see is that the regime itself, enacted here in the Nairobi City and Water and Sewage Company, has to develop a kind of an ambidextrous strategy. It has to maintain a business as usual while at the same time trying to do things differently, innovate differently, but also be able to develop an interaction with other types of actors that are not the usual actors that that these kinds of regimes have developed over time. So I think these are some interesting issues that are happening when we're thinking about introducing new ideas in the water energy sector. We need to think about how different actors interact with each other, and also what could be possible challenges around that. And so here, we work from the Global South in particular has a lot to bring to the discussion on transitions, particularly because in cities like Nairobi, but also other cities that I've worked with, there is much more heterogeneity in terms of water services, energy services, and while you have a predominant regime, you also have at the same time a number of different, sometimes competing models for delivering services. And so I want to now introduce this idea of so given this background of interaction of different regimes, we essentially see it looks a bit like in this figure really what we are observing. There is an established regime, a traditional actor, let's say, with a nested hierarchy. So it could be, for instance, a water company. And they have an established set of users to which they provide a service. And here we have, especially in the upper part of this framework, you see that innovation is primarily driven by a small set of actors. But if we look at the niche level, the picture is very different. You may even have users or customers that are not at all integrated in the regime. And you have innovation driven by heterogeneous actors. While these processes are happening together, we do perceive a need to actually understand how they interact. And here comes this particular critical interface between niche and regime. And so with that, we've basically taken some new concepts that I'm also introducing in the paper. One is that there is a critical interface. So if we want to understand how change happens, we really need to understand this critical interface as an interaction between regime and niche level actors. And we also need to understand the types of misalignments that can occur when these types of actors are not communicating effectively. When that happens, there is an interface misalignment, which can lead to a lack of integration of any technology with its surroundings. And through this interface misalignment, we can the scope for winners and losers actually becomes much bigger. And as I mentioned previously, by winners and losers, I want to flag that it's basically heterogeneous actors, both from niche and regime types of innovation processes that might be pursuing dominance in the energy and water system. But they're doing it actually through very different instruments, very different logics, and very different tools. So I want to make this a little bit more concrete by just flagging one of the cases that we are using. I would have liked to be able to talk about different ones, but I think that in the interest of time, that would be difficult to do. But I just wanted to illustrate one case, which is this technology which is used for energy recovery from wastewater, as I said. And this is a building which is based right in the middle of Stockholm, actually, very close to the central station of Stockholm. And you can see that in the right figure. And this is a building that is right in the central district of Stockholm. And it has commercial purposes, primarily commercial purposes. For instance, there is a hotel, there is a restaurant, but there is also offices. And on the left-hand side, again, starting from the basement of this particular building, we see a heat recovery exchanger being installed. And what this heat exchanger does, which is essentially this the long silver tube, what it does is essentially it captures the heat from the wastewater and it brings it back into the circulation of energy of the building. So what that means in practice is that this particular actor here, we could call this niche level actor, has the opportunity to reduce monthly energy costs. So essentially drawing far less energy from the main grid, the regime. And by doing so, they are essentially, through interviews and material we have collected, we see that they feel that they are essentially fulfilling certain environmental values. And they are also doing that in a way that provides them strong economic incentives. So it is useful to see that the motivation behind doing that is driven on the one hand by economic incentives, like, for instance, reducing costs of energy in the form of electricity bills. But it's also driven by sort of an ethic or a value of trying to achieve a more environmentally friendly building. So generally, while these solutions have some technical issues because they are at an early, or one could say near pilot level implementation, although they are growing, and this particular actor has actually started to install the same systems in other buildings in Stockholm, but also other parts of Sweden. We see that generally these are regarded as sort of positive developments from the point of view of these niche actors. And but if we turn on the regime actors then, So here, the two actors that are of interest to us are for the Stockholm Water Company and the district heating company of Stockholm. And so this is the company that essentially is responsible for providing heat in the entirety of the Stockholm center, the center of Stockholm. So these are important regime actors in our view, and we have been interacting quite a lot with them to essentially project these types of insights that are coming from these niche actors to them and getting their feedback around that. And of course, they have some concerns, and some of these concerns are related to how their operations might be affected negatively or positively by these types of innovations. So in a way, even though in some sense they are fulfilling some important goals in terms of meeting the SDGs, for instance, and creating energy efficient buildings, at the same time, they are contradicting certain logics around how energy and water needs to be distributed. So this becomes more evident when we look at some scenarios. So we've developed one scenario, for instance, where 40% of the existing building stock in Stockholm would install these kinds of systems or similar types of systems. And then we can see that, for instance, the demand for heat at the wastewater treatment plant could actually increase by 6%. That's because the heat that is now arriving at the wastewater treatment plant is far less. Similarly, the recoverable heat from the district company could decrease by 11%. These are tentative figures that we are trying to calibrate, but the important point is that there are going to be changes in terms of the demand for heat, but also in terms of the recoverable heat. And these regime actors are particularly concerned about that, because what that would mean is that they would have to essentially find that heat or that energy elsewhere. Does that mean then for them that they would have to pay for that? Does that mean that they would have to change some of the configurations of their current infrastructures? So these are some of the questions that are concerning particularly some of these regime actors. And so that to us is a kind of an interface misalignment between a niche level activity, which generally has some positive normative goals, and also on the other hand, a regime activity that is particularly concerned with maintaining service. They are particularly concerned that their services are not going to be affected, and they will be able to maintain a kind of a business as usual approach. And this is from one of the other cases, but it's also similar here. And what is actually interesting is that some of these niche level actors are interested in taking ownership of important services themselves. And they're interested in developing and maintaining some of these innovations for water energy through their own types of capabilities. And so, in a way, they want to detach entirely from an established regime, or at least say that they will want to have the minimum type of interaction with them because they believe that they can actually do a better job. So that also can create a kind of a conflict between the different actors. And so this was another kind of case study where we looked at, for instance, how more at the community level there was a kind of a combined engagement to create a small water network outside the grid, and then that was entirely driven by this particular person, Johan Newman, and using a different types of skills, sets of skills and experiences to actually develop that. And by managing to actually ensure buy-in by the local community, he also managed to, in that way, to convince the water company to essentially have the system there, but in a way that is not entirely agreed upon, or is a bit in a kind of a vulnerable point right now as to how this could develop. But just by looking at the motivations, it's interesting to look at how, for instance, when we look at these transitions, the types of values and aspirations that some of these actors have are driven by a different set of paradigms, a different set of ideologies than the conventional ways in which we've developed systems in the past. So in a way, it's not only a clash of different types of technologies. It's also a clash of different ideas about how water services should be comprised in the future, and what is a better solution. And so if we take like a system view, we can see different types of important areas of engagement. Here, as I said, there's like a district heating company, a water utility company. On the right side of this system, then you have a central wastewater treatment plant in the middle, but then on the other side you have potentially a local area where they are trying out a different type of innovation. And what I wanted to flag here is that this system view, which we are using to develop some of the models, allows us to look at this interaction not only in terms of actors, but also in terms of flows of materials. So you can see that with some of these lines, I want to bring to your attention that these infrastructures and the actors that are attached to all of these infrastructures, they are actually connected through different types of flows. This could be water, this could be heat, this could be simply grey water and energy. So it's important to understand that some of these misalignments and the winners and losers perspective has to do with how some of these flows are disrupted, essentially, or changed. And that creates, of course, a type of a scope for winners and losers in this situation. I would like to, therefore, I see enough come to the concluding slide. So some important points. We are actually kind of in the middle now of our research, and we are still developing various ideas around, particularly around what it look like, but something that is becoming quite evident, especially if we look at the R cases in Sweden, is that while transitions are generally in the literature, they're kind of celebrated as generally being a good thing to happen to, and especially sustainability transitions. But what we see is that while transitions need to occur, sustainability transitions need to occur, we need better ways of dealing with energy, we need better ways of dealing with water services. But we need to understand that when we change things, there are also going to be winners and losers associated with these changes. And these types of winners and losers are operating in a kind of unequal playing field of interactions. So that is one important insight that we have. Another important insight is that the dominant regimes are actually quite hard to change, and that is partly because of their own dynamics, because of the types of issues that they are trying to address, and also because of their history, which, as I said before, it affects what infrastructure they have to work with. It affects what kind of organizations they have to use. So we have to understand. What is the scope for change, actually, when we look at these types of regimes? What is the scope for change? What leverage there is for change? Water and energy are particularly sticky sectors. We do not see the dominant regime which exists now to be completely changed. We do see certain scopes for modifications and changes, but we do largely see them as being harder to change, like as opposed to maybe other sectors. So in some ways, they're going to be part of negotiating some future scenario. And so these systems are essentially tightly coupled. And what we feel it needs to happen is that there needs to be a stability in the regime, but there needs to be enough space for new entrants to take place. Because actually, some of the things that they are proposing and some of the ideas that they're coming up with and innovations are actually very important and can lead us faster to achieving certain ambitious goals, such as around the SDGs. But there are also, at the moment, some important pitfalls with respect to actually achieving that, which might also be true when we look at other sectors or indeed other cities or countries. And that is that these types of actors, and as you can tell, I've taken this sort of actor-driven approach in this project, they don't actually meet very often. So they don't really know very much about each other and why they are doing things in the way they are doing. So we are, as I said, we're trying to make this space for interaction through the project that we are working with and through, for instance, the KTH Living Lab and other kinds of similar spaces. But more has to be done. More initiative probably has to be taken by some of the dominant players in these transitions. And in instigating some of these changes, there needs to be more space for connections in terms of sharing resources, ideas, and practices with each other. Because as it is right now, there is, as I said, quite a bit of skepticism on both sides in terms of how one side can benefit from the other. There is collaboration, but a lot of the time is a sort of a subtle conflictual interaction which is taking place. So we think that has to be turned around. There needs to be greater recognition, for instance, of the value of collaborating across established business models, and that can be done, for instance, through creating certain new kinds of institutional actors that can actually operate in this critical interface that I illustrated later before, and how within the critical interface they have an opportunity to gain insight about actors can work with each other. And so a lot of the work that we think has to be done is more institutional. It's more about understanding different organizational logics and less about technology per se, because these technologies have a kind of a thrust of their own. But what is not very well understood is how these technologies are going to be compatible, for instance, with existing organizational models and logics. So that's a little bit where we are now and what I had to share with you today. I would like to thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to accept any insights, comments, or questions about this talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Timos. That was really great. Thank you for this very insightful talk, and also thank you for talking about the nexus, energy and water nexus, that is so central in our project. And I think that we will profit from your approach, but also for having you as a collaborator and get advice from you and all the colleagues in KTH. That was really great, and I think that this is the kickoff of a very nice collaboration with you, Timos. So we will get some questions. I have a lot of questions, but I will reserve myself only to one to kick off the discussion. And those who have questions, please either use the chat box to send me the question and I will deliver it to Timos, or you can unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. So just one question from me, and in order to leave the audience to think a little bit more. Timos, where the issue of power resides in your approach and scheme, because you are talking about the interaction between regime and niche technologies and niche innovations. So, and we know from existing work in transition studies that this interaction, particularly at interfaces, it can be very with a lot of tensions, and power is very important, both in order to secure the transition, but also the distribution of power is very important in order to secure an equal and just transition. So because you are talking about interfaces, and so I want to ask you where power resides in those interfaces and how important is power and the distribution of power in getting those niche innovations in the regime. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that was also why I've sort of have always had a very central concern about power in my work, and I believe that is actually a very important aspect of what is going on here. There is a certain degree of power in terms of, for instance, kind of ideological power, but also organizational power in terms of which particular actor has the ability to essentially propagate, as I said, dominance within the system. I would say that at the moment, the regime, of course, has much more power, actually, but in terms of, actually making decisions and actually allowing some of these things to occur. But I also want to show that these niche actors are also in different ways becoming more powerful. They are becoming increasingly more powerful, and they are actually able to become more powerful because they are ascribing to some of these larger ideas, like, for instance, about environmental values or about economic incentives. This is what's allowing them to create a business model that is becoming more powerful. And so, in a way, that's why there is a kind of, I believe, a type of a constant contestation right now for dominance, and it is actually a field which is not going to be decided today or tomorrow, because these systems are so difficult to change. So yeah, I would just have to say that the power comes up in this in so many ways, and I think the transitions discussion is getting much more into questions of power than it did, say, maybe 10 years ago. And I think that's also a positive development, why I'm also able to connect now much more with these transition discussions. But I also, regarding your point about the interface, so the interface is this interface between an established regime, like a water company in this case, a accredited water company, and some of these actors that are doing things outside. So that for us is a kind of an interface there, where there is also scope for different types of power dynamics to occur.
Okay, thank you very much, Timos, for the response. And any questions, any comments, any suggestions to Timos? Please, the floor is to the audience. So we are open now to questions. And I have one question from Yannis Fotopoulos, who is a PhD student here in our department on STS. And Yannis is conducting his research on critical technological infrastructures and has done a lot of work on energy infrastructures, but also on telecommunication infrastructures. So the Yannis' question is, has the national legislation provided initiatives or obstacles to new niche entries in the regime, and in which ways? Do you think that the regulatory framework is important in creating the notion of winner or loser in that pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that is a very good question. Thank you, Yannis, for asking this question. It is very important in terms of actually creating a much more, in terms of creating this kind of alignment that I was talking about. And there are legislations, but some of these legislations have simply not caught up with these types of niches. And so I would say that generally the legislation at the moment is in most cases not, I wouldn't say non-existent, but it's not strong enough. And if it is there, from our interviews, we find that it is possible that many of these actors, they might not even be aware of this legislation. What they seem to be aware much more, as I said, is I'm reflecting much more about these niche actors, which are kind of coming into this transition space. They seem to be much more aware of things like targets. For instance, okay, we need to have achieved that much reductions in our energy usage in our building within the next so and so years, which is a legislation, for instance, which Stockholm and the Energy Regulatory Authority has stipulated as law. And so this is the legislation that a lot of these property owners, for instance, will have to often cite when they are discussing what they're doing in terms of making their buildings more sustainable. But there is no specific legislation, for instance, about the effects, what would happen if you start to recover wastewater, or what would be the effects in terms of like, and some of the work that we are trying to do is to actually develop certain boundaries in terms of, for instance, what would be the tipping point in terms of, for instance, if the temperature would fall beneath that level, that would make it completely unacceptable for the water company to allow some of these innovators. So this is some work which we think is going to have an important impact in our dialogue, particularly with the regime actors, in terms of not in terms of paving the way towards some more calibrated types of regulations that really understand some of the dynamics of these types of innovations.
Thank you very much. Other questions or comments, please, as I said, use the chat box or just unmute your microphone and raise the question to Timos. Please. Any questions? Since the audience is timid or quiet,
Excuse me, could I make a question?
Yes, Mirto, yes, please, go ahead.
I was writing the question to you, but since you said to open the microphone, I'm going to use that. I heard you mentioned some economic incentives that can be a possible effect or a driver for people to collaborate more regarding those innovative initiatives. So I would like to specifically ask, to your knowledge, could a probable effect or boost in property values be an incentive, an economic incentive in boosting more collaborations between the actors involved?
Thank you, Mirto, for the question. I'm guessing you're referring to the value, the actual economic value of a building, in terms of the market value.
Of the building, of the area. You mentioned urban development, and
yeah. Okay,
so
I understand.
Plant the property value of a whole area, probably.
Yes, for sure. I think that a lot of these types of initiatives. Well, I mean, if I was to think about this in terms of the building stock, you have different types of building stocks, and I would say that as it is of now, I think it would have an effect on the economic value in the long term, but it's not very evident to, for instance, someone that wants to buy an apartment or will not necessarily, I think, be so aware what is making their building more energy efficient. So that is something actually that needs to happen, and there needs to be, and there is some work, for instance, around sensors being built so that you understand more clearly, for instance, how much water you are using. And at least when I look at the experience in Stockholm, there's a lot of interest right now in developing these kinds of things and actually marketing them and consequently creating higher value. And so I think it's going to be playing an increasing role, and potentially that could also create pressure for municipalities, for bigger organizations to accept some of these innovations in a better way. So I think we haven't actually explored this a lot, because we've looked really at the role of the innovators, the technology developers, the regime actors. But I think somewhere where we could definitely explore more is to look at actually the users, so the people that actually live in these houses and how they perceive. So I think that's an area where we can do more work to understand actually to what extent they would be negatively or positively affected in terms of the way they perceive sort of the value of where they live. So yeah, I think that's a good point for sure to look further into.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mirto, and thank you, Timos. Any other questions, suggestions, and
yes, Stathis, may I make a question?
Kostas, please. Yes. Kostas Vates has a doctorate from our department, and he's an economist and conducted practically and finished practically the first PhD on transition studies in our department. And,
okay. Yeah.
He's a specialist on energy and water here in Greece, and from today he's working also as a postdoc, one of the postdocs in CONEF. So after that introduction, please, Kostas, move on.
Hello. Thank you, Timos, for your presentation. I just want to ask something that has to do with what Stathis said earlier on. We know that in these processes there are power, as Stathis said. I think that you have also mentioned that in your conclusion, you talk about an equal playing field of interactions, but there is also conflictual politics in these processes. Transition studies talk about the resistance and the inertia that regime shows. So, because you said that the regime and its actors have to meet, I just wonder if you have thought of the way that in a conflictual process this could happen. You probably mentioned something, but yeah, I want to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kostas, for your point. I think you're basically going to the substance of what, in terms of how basically how do we proceed? What can we do to address this? Conceptually speaking, I'm actually trying to understand this myself in terms of, I'm trying to gain some insights, for instance, from current transition discussions around this. And for instance, there's a lot of work pointing towards what they call institutional work. So ways in which we need to basically change institutions or have specific actors that can work across institutions. Another idea which is becoming much more important is this idea of actually having spaces for transition, rather than looking at transition as being a niche activity or a regime activity. We need to think about transition as something that it's going to involve both, at least these two levels, possibly others. So that's some interesting ideas I'm picking up, at least from these transitions, is how to proceed. But very, very practically, something that we think we've been doing here with these actors is to bring them together in meetings as much as possible. We don't know yet how big effect that will have, but definitely trying to get them to talk with each other, because these are subtle conflicts. They're not like violent, or they could be, as you said, they could be very serious, but we see them as sort of subtle conflicts right now that are not necessarily very explicitly touched upon. They more come up in terms of the discussions that we're having. So I think one important point here is to facilitate some more discussion between these actors somehow, either through research projects, but that's not going to be enough. And I think one important area which has to be developed is, as I showed you a case of Nairobi, actually, where they're doing this, what we call ambidextrous innovation. So they basically have, for instance, sociologists, they call them sociologists, that work in some of these informal settlements, to essentially try to create that leverage, to essentially try to be able to connect with a different system. It's partially working, partially not working, but we definitely think that the regime actors have to, in some ways, make more initiative, because they have more resources. They also have more, possibly more knowledge, more expertise, so they are in a good position to address some of these conflicts.
Okay, thank you.
Timos, thank you, Kostas. Any other questions, comments, suggestions to Timos? Please move on. Yes?
Hello, this is Alex, also a research assistant in the CONEF project. Timos, thank you so much for your presentation. My question will take us a bit away from Kostas' question. Is somewhat more practical, and it pertains to the choice of cases you have made. Specifically in the draft that has been shared, you are mentioning 3 cases. The one of the reuse of grey water in Gothenburg, the recovery of heat from the wastewater in Stockholm, and the small grids for water and sewage in Värmdö, if I'm pronouncing it sufficient way.
It's a good pronunciation.
Yeah. So also today you mentioned the interesting case in the Global South. So my question would be, what's your process maybe, or what has been your process in this specific draft to choose some cases rather than others in trying to proving your point, and if there are some more cases that you're still considering for adding later on to supporting this this model?
Yes, thank you for this question. Thank you. It's a good question about our methodology, actually. And what I would like to say about that is that, okay, the case of Nairobi has nothing to do with this project. Actually, I was just reflecting on that in terms of how conceptually we can learn from work in the Global South. Because usually we tend to take cities in the Global North as the standard. And having worked a lot in cities of the Global South, we see so many amazing, interesting insights that can come from the way infrastructures are organized there. So that was more of a conceptual point, in a sense that that case is not really part of this Swedish research as such. It's more informing the way we are thinking about these infrastructures. But the other cases, the starting point was to identify cases where this is really kind of happening. So in a sense, it's real cases of disruptive innovation. We think these constitute real cases of disruptive innovation. And so we have selected them in terms of trying, and another thing that we were particularly interested in is that they were disruptive, but they were also, in a way, nexus-related case studies. So they were basically somehow, maybe you might think in an indirect way, but at least it's connecting in some ways water and energy in an interesting way. So I think those were the reasons we selected these cases. I would say that the case of Gothenburg and Stockholm are more comparable because it's about recovery of resources. The Värmdö case is perhaps a little bit of an outlier in our framework because it's not recovery of heat on water. Actually, it's more about decentralization, decentralized grids, and so on. But somehow we've included it because we thought that we can learn some interesting things about business models. And so what kind of business models propel these types of decentralized solutions? So in a way, the Värmdö case is more like I don't know if I should call it a control case, but somehow it helps us to understand the other cases better, if I was to put it that way. So essentially, we have 3 cities that we work with: Gothenburg, Stockholm, and Värmdö is actually within the region of Stockholm, but it's a bit outside. And so these are the 3 main areas we're working with. But in Stockholm, for instance, there's the KTH Living Lab, but there's also this other installation I was showing you, and there's a few more. Because we needed to cover a few to understand the performance, for instance, so how well they perform, what would happen if they diffuse. So that's a little bit how we reasoned around these different case studies.
Thank you, Timos. Thank you, Alexandros. Just to mention that Alexandros is one of the core members of CONEF and a PhD candidate and one of the very best students in our department. He was very modest presenting himself. Any other question? A question to Timos? Any suggestion? Can I raise one question if the audience doesn't have any other question? You mentioned about conservation, and you mentioned about niche technologies of efficiency, energy efficiency, or water supply efficiency. What about values of sufficiency that seems now to be very important in the transition studies in order both to read the politics of infrastructures, but also to really, let's say, set the pathways, either of the transition pathways of the regime or of the alignment of the regime. So.
Yeah, thank you, Stas. I really like what you said. I think it was a very nice contribution in terms of, politics of sufficiency, not just efficiency. I think it's really true, actually. And I must say that it's actually one of these points that we need to think a bit more about in terms of how can this type of politics of sufficiency and values around sufficiency can be cultivated within these organizations. As I said, like this water regime is really dominated by politics of efficiency right now. They're not really interested by sufficiency at all. And I'm actually trying to look at this in another project in terms of how, for instance, ideas of nature come into the discussion of water and infrastructure, and ideas like taking care of nature, how that comes into the discussion. But at the moment it isn't really there, and I want to introduce that somehow into my thinking. How can we think much more around sufficiency as a way to maybe it could be like, for instance, an incentive for dialogue around these actors. And maybe you are seeing some of these issues, for instance, in the case studies in the CONEF project. I would like to learn more about that. But I would say that at the moment it's more about control. So controlling a particular model so that it doesn't get affected by some new ideas in some sense. So it's a very conservative logic, I would say. The energy company is talking more about sufficiency, but they think that they can do it themselves. They are a powerful actor. They do not need to engage with these niche actors. They have their own way to produce renewables. They have their own way to produce systems. So in a way, that is another way in which there is a kind of a conservative type of culture around these questions. So the way that sufficiency, I think, is brought around is what I said about this. A lot of these actors that are doing something new in energy and water, they're doing it because they aspire to something other than efficiency. It could be that they want to try they get a lot of actually satisfaction and about trying something which is not conventional, and in a way trying out something that could address, for instance, some environmental goals. And it's very, it's a kind of a value system that leads us to thinking to sufficiency, but I would say there are strong economic incentives, actually, both from the actors we talked about. They have very strong economic incentives because they see an opportunity to reduce the costs, their costs for energy, and they see an opportunity to not having to rely on these traditional regimes. So I would like to, though, be able to interrelate this idea of sufficiency. I will think about it because I think it's actually quite important to, especially in terms of nexus issues.
Thank you, Timos. Any other comments or questions to please go ahead. I don't think that we have any other question, and knowing that you are short of time, Timos, I think that we can close here. I would like to thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk and a fascinating topic, very that resonates very nicely to what we are doing here in Athens. It was a great pleasure and a real insightful talk. This was the first talk of the series on sustainability, techno-sciences and transitions, from history to contemporary environmental and social challenges. I think that this was a real successful and very nice talk. I would like to thank you. We aspire for more, for having more talks by you, and definitely for collaborating with you and the whole team in KTH. With we know people there, and you need to let's say give our regards from Athens to the whole there, KTH.
I'll make sure to do that.
Arn Kaiser, long-time friends. And I would like to thank all the participants and all the people in the audience who joined us in this kickoff seminar. There is a series of webinars already scheduled. The program is out, so you can check and register for the talks that you are interested. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Timos. That was great. It was a really pleasure, and congratulations for a fascinating paper and also for an excellent research. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stathis, and everyone. Actually, I'm very eager to continue discussions with you. I will also follow the seminar series to engage in discussions that way. I would like to thank you in return, Stathis, for initiating this. I think it's a great idea. It's bringing a lot of us into discussions. And for reaching out to me. So thank you very much. And I look forward to interacting with all of you as part of these discussions, which seem to be resonating with the work that all of us are doing actually in Sweden and other places. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you, Timos. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Take care. Good night.
Bye.